Reading data from database. In this video, we're going to create the GET service to fetch data from the database. GET represents the letter R in the CRUD acronym, and it is one of the HTTP request APIs used to perform data read. The GET API is usually associated with two URL endpoints. The URL without an ID returns all the records in a table or collection. The one with the ID returns a single record matching that ID. So let's go ahead and create the GET service to fetch all records from the database. Alright, so here in the IDE, just make sure you open the provider.service.ts file. And the first thing we need to do is to inject the HTTP client to this class. So you inject data to this class by going to the constructor and create a private variable. We call this HTTP colon, and the type of this variable type will be the HTTP client. That's how you inject data to a class or to a component. Okay, so now through this HTTP object, we can then access all the get, put, post, and delete methods of the CRUD operation. And those will be processed through AJAX behind the scene, which you don't have to do that manually because Angular provides that services already, so which is pretty cool. Okay, so we got that injected. So now we can go ahead and create the get all records here. So it'll be just a function called get providers. And this function is going to return a type of observable. Okay, so observable here, I'll type any, explain in a minute. Okay, so observable is part of the RxJS library. RxJS stands for Reactive Extension JavaScript, which is a library that uses the reactive programming design to help us, or also to help Angular manage and also to detect and I guess propagate or move a change of data. It's kind of hard to, it's a lump sum there to swallow, but that's all it is. It's observable. It's a special function that wraps another object. That object is called the observer. It's responsible for executing all these instructions. In this case, it would be to fetch data, to delete data, and so forth from the server. And then once that change has been made, or if there is a change in the state, it will return some values back to us. Okay, so that's what it is. So if you know exactly what type you need to get back, you can put inside here inside of the any to be the exact type. If you're absolutely sure, for example, we're getting some data back, we expect this to be like the provider's class, right? If you put that in here, then just make sure it is going to be that type. If it's not, it might have a problem. So since it's possible, we might get back a collection of all this, a list of all these records, or you might just get a string back, right? So we don't know. So therefore, it's always safe to put here of type any. Okay, and then now because we're using a strict type, as you can see, if you mouse over that, it says you must return a value, right? So in here, we're going to return the data coming back from the server. In this case, we're going to get that from the HTTP object. So return this HTTP that, as you can see, the get, the put, post, and delete all in here. And those are the ones that we need. So we need to get the get function. And then this get function here takes a couple of parameters, but the one that is required, if you press Control spacebar, you see, well, I think I missed it, but if you type it again, it will show you. There, so we have the URL. We need that URL string that is required. Okay, so here this be just the API URL. We pass that over. You make the AJAX call. Well, later when it comes back, and then this observer will notify whoever makes a request to this function. Okay, whoever subscribes to this function. Okay, so that is all we need for this part of the service. So this service get providers is now available to whoever or wherever it's being needed. So we need that to inject this service called provider service into this component here, providers here. So open the providers component, and then inside here as well, same as before, we're going to inject the provider service. So private data called, I'll call it provider service, the same name with the lowercase, and then of type provider service. the service class we created is imported now. So now we're going to fetch the actual data from the database. Therefore, we're not going to need this local data here anymore. Okay, so I'm going to change these providers here to the class, and we can use that class to receive all the data coming back from the database. So this one here, I'm going to change it to a type of provider class. Okay, and then now we are ready to make this call. Okay, so to make the call, you can invoke it in here in the init function, or it's usually typical to put another function here called load data, and we'll just invoke this function here inside the init. So here with this load data. Okay, we invoke the function. So here we'll subscribe to that service through the provider service object. Okay, so here we say this dot provider service dot get providers. That's the function we create inside this class here. This is the one. So we're going to invoke this function, and then what this one does is, now if you just do something like that, if you just leave it like that, it's not going to work. So if you expect to do something like, for example, this dot providers equals that, okay, it won't work because, as you can see, you have a mismatch here. I'm expecting a class type, but here it says, but this one returns an observable of any, so there's no match here. And if you convert it to that type, it won't work because, again, you have to subscribe to this service. So what that means is the data will come back not like this fashion, but come inside the subscribe function. So the subscribe is basically you chain it with the dot and the word subscribe. The function returns an object of or 3 values. Okay. If I do this, you'll see those 3 values. Okay, you see that we have a next, the error, complete, and then the close. Well, the close we don't do because it will do it automatically. But the next here returns the actual data coming back. So the payload, whatever it is, been sent from that server. And if there's no data, if there's an error, then the error will be invoked, and then the complete will always be invoked, whether there's an error or not. So this is like the promise. Okay, same thing. So it's usually you put it into a separate line because it's just easier to read. And so I'm just going to get the first one, which is the data. What would be the data and the error? And this data here, and let's put into a separate line. Okay, so the data, you can call this whatever variable you want. I call it data, but you can be anything, just a variable. And we use the error function to return something here. So that's the first part. The second is the error. So the error can also be used if you want to do that. Just in case, you can console log that to the browser, to the console, so you can see. So console log the error. Okay, and then the data. Now this data is the actual payload that's coming back from the server. So then we can assign this to this variable providers here. So right in here, we say this provider equals the data. And now that looks good, right? So we can save this and make sure there's no errors. And then we need to go back to the backend and activate our app backend here. Okay, so let's go to the terminal and let me open and go to the backend and go ahead and run the application. Okay, so that's good. And also make sure your MongoDB is running as well. So if I open the MongoDB, we should have the provider DB created with the providers. If you have no records in here, just make sure you can import that collection from the data source. So we have those data source from the files. Okay, so there are about 20 providers in here. And so let's go back. All right, so it's running. That means that's good. And then we can go back to Angular and run our app. Okay, so type ng-serve. And I'm expecting some error here because there's one thing that we didn't do before in the backend. I mean, for security reasons, Express app will not allow any outside server to access its data. Okay, so through something called a CORS, right? So for cross origin services issue. So we have to make sure that's available. We have to open that port or that origin to allow a certain site to access the data for security reasons. So we want to make sure that it's allowing the port 4200 to access the data. So let's go to the browser and see if our app is running. So as you can see, if I refresh it, and there's no data, okay, no data coming from the database. So at least we know it's working. It did not load the actual data. If you press F12 key, and you will see that we have some errors. Okay, so one of these is access to the XML HTTP request, which is AJAX to this provider from this origin has been blocked by the CORS policy. So we have to go to the Express application and allow this server to give access to this Angular application at port 3000. Okay, so to do that, we need to go back to the back end. And so if you just open that another tab, leave the app running, go back to the back end, and we need to install a package called CORS. Okay, so just type in npm install CORS and then -- save dev. Okay, so that is a library that we can use to set CORS, a CORS header in the Angular, in the Express application. So you can close that now. It's imported, and now open the backend and open the app.js files. We need to import that in here. So you can use var or const as a matter. CORS require from the CORS library. Okay, and then we need to use it. So right below here, when we create the app, you can do a var app.use, and then we'll put CORS in here. Okay, if you just do like that, right? If you do that, it's going to var, sorry, just app. If you do that, if you invoke the CORS function, it's gonna open the port to anybody in the server. So we don't want that. Okay, we want to whitelist a certain site only. So in this case, we just want to open to the port 4200 for our application. So in here you can type, it's an object, so you can have the first thing is the origin, and the origin is from the HTTP localhost port 4200. Okay, so we whitelisted the Angular port, so that will allow it'll allow Angular to access this data. That's all we're gonna do here. Okay, so save that, and it should be working. I suppose if it's not working, we'll just reboot the server. So let's go back and try it again, and refresh the Angular app. And there you see that no errors comes through. We close this. You see that all the data comes through just like before. There are 20 in the app here. I mean, how do we know for sure it's coming from the database? We can always check, right? So let's go to the database, and let's just change Marilinda's name to a different name. So back here, here's her name. I'm going to change it to just say Mary. Okay, and we'll update that. We'll save that. So go back to the app and refresh it, and there it is. It's Mary. So as you can see, it's working beautifully. Next, we'll create the API for adding new data to the database using the HTTP POST request.